I am Dr. KenZoe Brian J. Selassie. I will be presenting on Return of the God Kings and Queens. It feels a little strange to be so far away from the image that I'm going to be referring to, so I'll try to stand as close to it as possible. My presentation is going to focus on just a few items. It'll talk about context of the study, the purpose of the study, the method, the examples, and then the findings. So the context of my study, in essence, really, it's talking about this aspect of looking at hip-hop and trying to understand the meanings and make sense of the meanings that come about as a result of hip-hop, which is really just Black culture that is manifest through a particular view of a generation that has come about as a result of like civil rights movement, Black power movement, and several other socio-politically driven movements that articulate Black thought, Black sound, Black life, Black experience manifest into music as one aspect of art form. This particular presentation is really pulled from my dissertation. My dissertation focused on looking at Black vernacular in a linguistic context, but this particular chapter really focused on something that I thought was really interesting, which was that, in essence, spending the summer in 2011, listening to Kanye West, Rick Ross, Nicki Minaj, and Jay-Z, the song Monster. And I was listening to it and I was just like, yeah, like I'm a monster, like I'm a beast, like I'm gonna be a like ghetto geek, like I'm gonna be a hip hop scholar, all-star, like, so I'm into the music. And as I'm getting into the music, I'm thinking to myself though, what does it actually mean though? So if I'm getting excited about these lyrics, what am I really getting excited about? What am I tapping into and allowing to sort of shape, if you will, my own idea about who I am and how I express how I am, but then also how I see the world and other people in that world. And so this becomes the context, and the context is key because this is sort of the origin of how I started to orient my aspect of my identity and who I am, with all of those layers coming from, you know, a life of hardship, a life of less privilege, into a very privileged context of being able to pursue a PhD, earn a PhD, but then find myself in a scholarship among people who oftentimes come from a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds and experiences. And so finding myself in hip-hop and validating the experience of who I am in hip-hop became significant to figuring out what I wanted to really be able to study and build upon. And so it just started by listening to a song, writing a paper about a song, and that paper became my entire dissertation. And this chapter of my dissertation is now part of what I'm presenting today. Purpose of the study. So the reason why building upon this chapter is important is because what you'll find as I start to explain through some of the examples, and I know I'm talking in some sense of obscurity now, but what you'll start to find is that one of the re-emerging themes among Black people, especially in hip-hop, is this idea of being disconnected from Africa, but constantly making references to things that are very antiquitous and that are very consistent with African culture. And so I don't want you to be thrown off by the fact that many of the images are oriented out of Egypt or Kemet, but this reflects the whole of Africa in the variety of different religions that exist, but more importantly, this aspect of African spirituality, which is a universal in the context of Black culture. And so to know that hip-hop artists through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s are placing and embedding in their lyrics aspects of Black culture and Black consciousness is very significant to the overall idea of commercialism that starts to diminish these aspects of how we celebrate ourselves and how we celebrate culture, but get into the more commercial aspects that celebrate Eurocentric value by virtue of individuality, economics, and the like. So, my method. My scientific method for how I engaged in this study was really focused on using a couple of different methods. I used Afrocentric method to make sure that my cultural perspective, my cultural consciousness was clear so that I can make delineations about what is something that historically has been considered black culture and something that is historically considered maybe European culture or Asian culture. Being able to make those delineations and understand the parameters of where one culture starts and where one culture stops is important because it helps to isolate what it is that I want to talk about in a very specific and consistent manner. The other aspect is that I borrow from ethnomusicology in trying to just examine lyrics for their connotative and denotative meanings, and making sense of what we have before us as material is always of critical importance, but is also, in fact, part of the Afrocentric method. Collectively, the scientific method can be considered qualitative interpretive. So let's get into some of the examples, which I think is just a lot more fun than being overly scientific. Although all of it is scientific, but I think you get my point. In this particular example, you have Salt and Pepper, who were mentioned this morning. I was almost surprised at how frequently they continue to reemerge in our dialogue. But one of the things that Pep says in her lyrics is, I grip the mic like a pit bull terrier, yes, but I'm scarier. Under a ton of rhymes, I'll bury you. And I'm gonna just play just a little bit for you because this wouldn't be hip hop and we just talk about hip hop, or this wouldn't be a hip hop conference and we just talk about hip hop, but we don't actually have music to accompany the narrative. So just a bit.
To believe EFCE, our glass soul is making G's. Save that crap, I got my public to rap to. Try to play me out, I wanna slap you, punk, for being disrespectful. I grip the microphone like a pit bull terrier. Yes, but I'm scarier. Under a ton of rhymes, I'll bury ya. Hype like a poet on a mic, I'll show it. Do re mi fa sol la ti do it.
Keep going. So. Huh? Sounds better than Nikki. So listen, this particular aspect is important. And the reason why this is important is because, albeit it may seem like she's only talking about, gripping the mic like a pit bull terrier, it's very surface. When you start to think about this context, and I spent a lot of time, when you're working on a dissertation, you just spend a lot of time thinking in general, but you find yourself so immersed in the research, and that's one of the things that I like about being at a historically black university and being able to talk about Afrocentricity in such a free manner, is that in a Eurocentric context of research, there's this idea that the research is always supposed to be, objective, that you cannot find yourself in the research. But when you immerse yourself from an Afrocentric perspective in the research, you not only have an understanding of what is being spoken about, but you have the insertion of self to really look at and examine the different nuances that exist. And so, in thoroughly examining this, one of the things that I started to think about was Anubis. And so you have this context where Pep is saying, I grip the mic like a pit bull terrier. The lyrics are suggesting that she possesses a power that a pit bull terrier has. Now, a pit bull terrier typically has, most dogs actually, have a bite grip of about 320, in essence, 320 types of force versus like a person's bite grip, which is about 120. So 320 compared to 120. Like, it suggests that it's something very significant in the difference of just being human versus someone that is able to equip themselves with elements that are out of nature. And so that comment brings us to the heart of what I'm really getting at, which is the rap lyrics that a lot of hip-hop artists are producing echo sentiments that, although they are just rhetoric, although it's part of the lyrical delivery, it's what ancient Egyptians were actually performing by virtue of these zoomorphic forms, wearing the headdress of a jackal and having the body of a human being. Performing it in ancient Egypt becomes similar to being able to just speak about it in a lyrical context in present day. And so what I'm trying to do is the same way that people will oftentimes try to say that Egypt is separate from Africa, when in fact it is not, is make the connection that hip-hop is not separate from black culture, and that the generation of today is really talking about and doing some of the same rhetorical performances and deliveries that we used to do in yesterday. In that we find our identity in finding the link between those aspects of rhetoric, those aspects of how we communicate. All right? I'm gonna just give another example. So actually, just real quick, another point of clarification. And actually, I just noticed this today, so it's not as if I knew this beforehand, but you're always learning. When I further looked at the lyrics for Pep, she said, "Under a ton of rhymes, I'll bury you." And the interesting thing about that is when you compare the fact that she's talking about a pit bull terrier who is similar to a jackal, similar in that they both operate out of sort of this canine dynamic, but that she's talking about under a ton of rhymes, I'll bury you, and Anubis is the god that performs embalming. He is the God that otherwise governs the underworld, but also prepares you for that transition into the underworld. So the intricacy of relationships that exist here is really fascinating, it's really phenomenal, and it's something to really be proud of in the context of being able to just see what happens when, if you will, genetic memory or subconscious memory or whatever the case may be for however you want to frame it, which is not my scientific area of expertise, is at play. These things start to sort of manifest again and surface. So you have Teedra Moses, who is an R&B singer. And the interesting thing about, at least one of the things that my dissertation spoke about, which I thought was interesting, was that oftentimes when we talk about hip-hop, people want to make hip-hop rap. And hip-hop is so much more than rap, because hip-hop is just about how people live. It's an attitude that a particular generation had, and so, and still have to a large degree. And so when you talk about someone like Teedra Moses, although her classification musically is R&B, her style, attitude, and generational orientation is hip-hop. And so what she reflects in this album, The Lioness, which is so appropriately titled, is this aspect of Sekhmet, who is considered the goddess that is the daughter of the Egyptian god Ra. And so the significance of Sekhmet is that in certain aspects they talk about Sekhmet as someone who is the fierce or ferocious hunter. They also talk about her as protector. They also talk about Sekhmet as having an ability to affect the vocal cords, oftentimes able to take away breath but also give breath. And so to talk about being a vocalist, a singer, and the vocalics and the instrumentation of one's vocal cords to produce sound, it just makes it all the more apropos that yet and still someone else out of the hip-hop generation is producing a title of an album that just is so echoing the aspects of ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses that it's almost just undeniable, but it's just fascinating is the only word that I can come up with. And then you have my favorite guy, who is not, a lot of people don't like him, but, it is what it is. You have Kanye West, who says, have you ever had sex with a pharaoh? I struggled on whether I needed to play the lyrics or not because, it's Allen University and we are the school is AME. But for the purposes of being academic, all things in an academic context, we play these lyrics because part of being scientists is that we investigate what's going on in life. So even in academic spaces, we reserve the academic privilege of being able to and right to be able to talk about these things as they actually exist. I'm not going to play the whole thing for you. I'm just going to go.
Can you stop hitting my elbow? You see I'm doing things.
Because I think it's also important for you to be able to hear the lyrics as they are from the artist, opposed to me just reciting them. I think it just makes a big difference. If I can steady my hands, there we go. All right.
Yeah, if you wanna make it number one, you're number two now. Miss that goose in Malibu, I call it Malibu. Yeah, goddamn.
Got me so much.
Know that motherfucker well. What you gonna do now? Whatever I wanna do. Gosh, it's cool now. Not gonna do. It's new now. Think you motherfucker really need to cool out. Cause you will never get on top of this. So mommy, best advice is just to get on top of this. Have you ever had sex with a pharaoh? Put the pussy.
Okay. I think you get the point. So, even though it's really easy to say, oh, it's misogynistic, oh, it's, in some aspects it is, but if that's part of the culture, it's part of what we also have to examine. Black culture has both its functional and dysfunctional aspects, and both aspects of how we live are worth investigating, but all the more, both aspects are worth understanding that one aspect produces a healthier state of being in all aspects of how we live. I don't have an image, and I didn't think an image of a pharaoh was necessary because I think you all pretty much know what a pharaoh looks like. But the findings of this study, not to belabor on my presentation, but the findings of the study really just, because it's written out in essence as a paper, produce a wide variety of different types of information related to, in the 1980s, for example, you have the rapper Rakim with Microphone Fiend. He represents the East Coast male. LL Cool J, he's his song Jack the Ripper in 1988. East Coast male. Big Daddy Kane, rapper. Smooth Operator, 1989, East Coast. Lauryn Hill, R&B rapper. Ready or Not, 1996 release, East Coast. Lil' Kim, Lil' Kim always telling you want to rumble with the B, huh? Anytime we're talking about these aspects of how we adopt nature, not just by representation of what exists in terms of ancient Egyptian gods, but in the return of who we think of ourselves as gods in our right to commune with nature. But such a consciousness is oriented back into our own aspect of blackness and black culture and out of what has become universalized as a white, Eurocentric, or now Euro-American-centered aspect of culture. And this issue of identity, this issue of identity confusion, identity fusion, interculturalism, multiculturalism, create some issues with regard to how we aim to orient ourselves. And so when there's a clarity around where you orient yourself culturally, there's usually clarity around how you begin to express these aspects of culture in a very anchored, particular way. And in this particular way, these artists have managed to produce a variety of different lyrics, as well as through the 1990s and 2000. I can produce the list for anybody that would otherwise want it. But you've got Ice Cube, Outkast, The Roots featuring Bob Marley, DMX, Jay-Z, Common, Jill Scott. Jill Scott's song will Manifesto. She says, I am a grand dom queen beast. You've got Usher, Nas, in the likes of the game. So you've got male and female artists, R&B, hip-hop, rap, all of it is a part of the hip-hop generation. And that is, I thought actually that I was going to be last, so I have questions, but I think we're going to save questions for the end of the presentation. But that is my presentation as it stands.
Thank you very much.